It was barely past dawn on March 8, 2019, when the quiet routine of a Texas university campus was shattered by flashing lights. In the early morning haze, two unmarked black SUVs crept into the faculty parking lot of Hillcrest University in San Marcos, their engines humming low beneath the hum of cicadas. By 6:47 a.m., students arriving for morning lectures paused mid-step, watching in confusion as FBI agents in Navy windbreakers crossed the lawn with measured, deliberate strides. The spring air was cool, the light soft and pale, a morning that should have been ordinary. But in the next few minutes, nothing about Hillcrest would ever feel ordinary again. Inside the anthropology department, Professor Elizabeth Graves was sipping coffee at her desk, reviewing papers from her graduate seminar. The sun had just begun to reach across her window blinds when a shadow crossed the glass. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps. "Dr. Graves?" "Yes?" "Federal agents, ma'am. We need you to stand and step away from your desk." When the door opened, the hallway fell silent. Her colleagues watched as Dr. Elizabeth Graves, 58 years old, respected scholar, decorated researcher, and one of Hillcrest's longest-serving faculty members, was led out of her office in handcuffs. The sight was jarring. Graves was known for her calm precision, her crisp voice, her perfectly pressed linen suits. Not for this. Not for a headline that would soon read across every screen in Texas. FBI arrests professor in connection with 1989 missing girl case. Students gathered in clusters on the quad, murmuring her name like it was a ghost story. Some pulled out their phones, recording as the professor they once idolized was guided into a waiting SUV, her expression pale but composed, almost unnervingly so. By the time the first news chopper circled overhead, Detective Maria Lopez of the Travis County Cold Case Division stood outside the building, her badge glinting in the light. It had taken nearly 2 years of reinvestigation, advanced DNA testing, and digital reprocessing of old evidence to get to this moment. 30 years, Lopez muttered. And she was right here the whole time. The case they had reopened wasn't just any disappearance. It was Sarah Hughes, a 14-year-old girl who vanished from the small town of Redwater, Texas on June 5, 1989. Sarah had been last seen walking home from choir practice. Her bicycle was found near the old county bridge, its front tire bent, the seat missing. Despite days of searching, dogs, helicopters, volunteers sweeping through the fields, she was never found. Her mother, Linda Hughes, had kept her room untouched for decades. Every birthday, she placed a cupcake by Sarah's photo, a ritual of grief that became a local symbol of heartbreak. For years, the case had remained one of Redwater's darkest mysteries, until the autumn of 2018, when a construction crew digging a drainage system outside town unearthed a sealed metal box buried beneath layers of hard-packed clay. Inside was a child's locket, still faintly engraved with the initials SH, and beneath it, a plastic bag containing a fragment of cloth, pink, floral, faded with time. The locket matched the one Sarah's mother had described back in 1989. The cloth carried DNA, faint, almost disintegrated, but enough for a hit. When lab analysis came back weeks later, the results stunned investigators. A match to a partial DNA profile found on an old academic field kit preserved in storage at the University of Houston, dated the same year Sarah disappeared. The signature on that equipment tag? Elizabeth Graves. At the time, she had been a graduate researcher conducting a field study in Redwater on post-colonial rural traditions and burial rites. Local residents remembered her vaguely. A quiet, polite young woman who took notes, asked questions about community folklore, and often worked late into the night alone. But as one former deputy put it, no one ever suspected her of anything. That changed the moment the locket surfaced. When investigators re-interviewed old witnesses, one elderly woman recalled something strange: a gray pickup truck parked near the Hughes' property late at night that summer, its headlights off. Another said she'd seen a young woman fitting Graves' description, carrying a bundle toward the riverbank the week after Sarah vanished. At the time, neither detail had been pursued. But in 2018, With new technology and digital reconstruction tools, those forgotten statements were digitally cataloged and cross-referenced, revealing timestamps and handwritten notes tied to Graves' own research logs. The connection was undeniable. By February 2019, a federal warrant was signed for Elizabeth Graves' arrest. The evidence, while largely circumstantial, was bolstered by DNA probability, timeline consistency, and handwriting comparison from her own field notes, all pointing to direct involvement in the disappearance of Sarah Hughes. When the cuffs locked around her wrists that morning, the world around her shifted. Cameras captured the moment, freezing her composed face, the faint smile that looked less like calm and more like resignation. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said softly as they placed her into the car. "You people never understood." The footage aired across national networks by noon. By nightfall, the Redwater Baptist Church reopened its doors for a candlelight vigil. The pastor, gray-haired now, stood at the pulpit, voice shaking. "For 30 years, we've prayed for the truth. Maybe this is how God finally answers." In the corner pew, Linda Hughes sat clutching a photograph of her daughter, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I just want to know what happened. I don't care who it is anymore." But for those who'd known Elizabeth Graves, her colleagues, her students, even her neighbors, disbelief turned to unease. How could a woman so educated, so disciplined, have lived decades of normalcy while concealing something so monstrous? How could a crime this old, this buried, resurface now, in the most unexpected of places? As the agents drove her away and the cameras zoomed out, one chilling question hung in the Texas air like dust after a storm. What really happened to Sarah Hughes on that summer night in 1989? And how did Professor Elizabeth Graves manage to keep the truth buried for 30 years? The summer of 1989 in Redwater, Texas, was the kind that stuck to your skin. Humid, bright, and deceptively peaceful. The sound of sprinklers, radio static, and kids chasing each other through the heat carried across long, flat streets where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Until June. 14-year-old Sarah Hughes was the youngest of 3 siblings, a quiet girl with a shy smile and a soft, careful voice. She loved sketching in the margins of her school notebooks and sang in the youth choir at First Baptist Redwater, a whitewashed church that stood like a crown at the town center. On the evening of June 5th, Sarah attended choir practice as usual. Her best friend, Lydia Daniels, later told investigators that Sarah seemed distracted that night, her sheet music unopened, her eyes occasionally darting toward the back of the room. When practice ended just after 7:30 p.m., Sarah waved goodbye, climbed on her sky blue bicycle, and began the short ride home down Old Creek Road, the narrow dirt stretch that ran behind the cemetery and led toward her family's farmhouse. She never made it home. By 9 p.m., her mother, Linda Hughes, called the police. The dispatcher's notes from that night were short but chilling. Mother reports daughter missing, last seen on bicycle leaving church, 14-YO female, light brown hair, blue jeans, white shirt. Redwater police officers began a door-to-door search. At first they assumed she'd stopped at a friend's house or taken a longer route home. But by midnight, as flashlights cut across the empty fields and volunteer groups fanned out into the woods, that hope began to fade. At 1:16 a.m., a deputy located Sarah's bicycle, lying on its side near the old Redwater Bridge, just 3 miles from the church. The front wheel was twisted. Her backpack was unzipped. One of her sketchbooks was lying in the mud, pages torn by wind and water. That was the moment everyone knew, one retired officer later recalled. Something bad had happened. The next day, local newspapers printed her photo on the front page under the headline, "Teen Vanishes in Redwater, Community Launches Massive Search." Within 24 hours, the entire town was mobilized. Men brought dogs. Church members organized meal drives for searchers. Helicopters swept the edges of the Redwater River, their spotlights skimming over the thick green brush that lined its banks. It was during this chaos that investigators first encountered Elizabeth Graves. Though few remembered her name at the time, She was a 28-year-old graduate student from the University of Houston, conducting fieldwork in Redwater for her anthropology thesis on funerary rituals and cultural memory in southern rural communities. She'd been in town for about a month, renting a small guest room from the Dunn family, whose property sat only 2 miles from where Sarah's bike was found. Locals described her as polite, but distant. She attended a few church services, kept meticulous notes, and spent long afternoons photographing headstones and interviewing elderly residents about local folklore. On the morning of June 6th, while volunteers combed the fields, Deputy Ray Henson stopped by the Dunn property. Graves was in the yard, camera slung around her neck, sketching in a notebook. "You out here by yourself?" he asked. "Yes, sir. I'm documenting local burial customs for my research." "You heard about the missing girl?" "I did," she said softly. "It's terrible." Henson later noted that she didn't seem nervous, just oddly calm. He let her be. What he didn't know was that Graves's field log for that week, recovered decades later, contained a cryptic entry. 6:05, evening storm near bridge. Subject interrupted. Must return tomorrow. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Sarah stretched across miles of Texas countryside. Theories multiplied: runaway, kidnapping, river accident. But no trace of her was ever found. The Hughes family held vigils every night. Reporters filled the streets. Police interviewed every known acquaintance, including several men from the local lumber mill who'd been near the bridge that night. None of them panned out. By July, the case began to stall. Investigators combed through mud and debris near the river's edge, but found nothing more than pieces of torn cloth and fragments of jewelry. None conclusive. The FBI joined briefly, but without a body, they had little to build on. That's when the focus shifted to the people who'd been in the area. A partial witness statement from a farmer mentioned seeing a gray pickup truck parked by the bridge between 8 and 9 p.m., headlights off. Another said they'd noticed a woman walking alone along the field's edge that same night. But those details too faded into rumor. When the summer rains came, evidence washed away. The town returned to its slow rhythm, except for the Hughes family, who never stopped waiting for a knock at the door. Sarah's room stayed exactly as she left it. A Bible on the nightstand, a sketch of her church taped above her bed, and a jar of colored pencils lined in a perfect row. Each year, on June 5th, her mother would light a single candle and whisper the same prayer. "If she's out there, Lord, bring her home. If she's not, help me find where she rests." For 30 years, no one mentioned Elizabeth Graves again. She left Redwater that summer and completed her dissertation the following spring. It was titled, "Death and Devotion: Rural Texas Burial Practices in the Late 20th Century." The acknowledgments page thanked the residents of Redwater, Texas, for their openness and faith. And while the Hughes family grieved and detectives retired, Graves built a life, a career, a reputation, and eventually tenure. The town moved on. But the river never gave back its secrets, until 3 decades later, when a buried metal box unearthed by chance would reopen everything and expose a truth darker than anyone had ever imagined. Before her name became a headline, Sarah Hughes was just a girl trying to find her place in a small Texas town. She was born in 1975, the youngest of 3 children, and her family lived on a modest 5-acre property outside Redwater. Her father, Tom Hughes, worked at the local grain mill, and her mother, Linda, was a part-time seamstress who ran the church's food pantry on weekends. Life was simple, predictable, and until that June, entirely untouched by tragedy. At Redwater Middle School, Sarah was known as the quiet one. She wasn't shy exactly, but soft-spoken, careful with her words, the kind of girl who listened more than she spoke. She drew constantly, trees, birds, faces, and dreamed of becoming an art teacher one day. Her best friend Lydia said she loved Anne of Green Gables and thought sunsets looked like heaven's door cracked open. But beneath her sweetness was a growing restlessness. In early May of 1989, Sarah had started volunteering at St. Agnes Mission Church, just outside town, cleaning pews, sorting hymnals, helping the visiting anthropologist with her research. That anthropologist was Elizabeth Graves. Graves, then 28, had arrived in Redwater under the pretense of studying funerary culture and memory in small Christian communities. She was polite, meticulous, and always took notes. Locals described her as bookish but nice, the type of outsider small towns tolerated because she wasn't intrusive. When she met Sarah, something seemed to click, at least on the surface. Graves had asked for help transcribing local hymns and folk prayers. Sarah, curious and eager to please, began stopping by the mission after school to assist her. It started innocently enough. She'd say Miss Graves was smart, Lydia recalled years later. She'd tell us how she talked about death like it wasn't scary, like it was just another kind of memory. Their friendship raised no alarms then, but looking back, investigators would later see the subtle manipulation, how Graves cultivated trust, how she drew Sarah in with compliments and attention that felt safe. One afternoon in late May, Graves even drove Sarah home after a long work session. That was the only time Linda Hughes met her, a soft-spoken woman with dark hair and a small, polite smile. She thanked me for letting Sarah help her, Linda said. She said Sarah had an old soul. It wasn't until much later that Linda realized that conversation was the last time she would ever see her daughter alive. The week before Sarah disappeared, a few strange things happened. On June 1st, a neighbor saw an unfamiliar gray pickup truck parked near the old bridge. On June 3rd, Sarah told Lydia she wouldn't be at the sleepover that weekend, that she had something important to do for Miss Graves. And on June 5th, she showed up at choir practice looking distracted, humming absently and doodling instead of singing. That night, she rode away on her bicycle into the fading light, a ride that should have lasted 10 minutes. When Graves was questioned after the disappearance, she told investigators she'd left town that afternoon for a research trip and hadn't seen Sarah in days. She even produced her travel receipts, handwritten gas station stubs dated June 5th. But later forensic examination in 2018 revealed the ink on those receipts didn't match 1980s-era pen dye. They were falsified. In the weeks after Sarah vanished, the grief consumed Redwater. Flyers covered telephone poles. The Hughes porch light stayed on for months. Deputies dragged the river more than once, finding nothing but mud, dead fish, and discarded beer cans. For a while, suspicion hovered over transient workers, even Sarah's older cousin, who'd recently moved back into town. But nothing stuck. Meanwhile, Graves finished her research, quietly packed her car, and left Redwater by early July. Her notes from that summer, later uncovered during the reopened case, contained chilling details. Sketches of the same bridge where Sarah's bicycle was found, field maps of burial plots, and one unlabeled drawing, a young girl standing beside a cross. The heading read only, "Memory preserved in soil." Years passed. Sarah became a ghost in Redwater. Lydia grew up, left town, and started a family in Austin. The Hughes house grew quieter, older, its walls yellowing with time. Tom passed away in 2006, never knowing what happened to his daughter. Then in 2018, everything changed. A construction crew expanding the highway near the old river bend struck something metallic embedded in the clay. A sealed tin box, rusted but intact. Inside were old church trinkets, a lock of hair, and a tiny gold locket engraved with the initials SH. DNA tests would later confirm it matched Linda Hughes's genetic profile. And just like that, after 3 decades of silence, the case of Sarah Hughes, the little girl who vanished under a Texas sky, roared back to life. The discovery reignited local memory. Old witnesses came forward again, and when detectives followed the trail backward, through old university archives and anthropology department storage, one name appeared again and again: Elizabeth Graves. Her signature on a field report, her photo at the mission that summer. Her research files dated the exact week Sarah disappeared, and a single line from her old thesis, buried in the acknowledgement section: "To the memory of what is buried, but never lost. It was enough to reopen everything. 30 years later, her past would come for her, in the form of a knock on a faculty office door, a pair of handcuffs, and a camera waiting outside. By August of 1990, the Texas heat had burned away what little hope remained in Redwater. 3 months had passed since Sarah Hughes disappeared. The posters on telephone poles had faded, their ink bleeding under summer rain. Volunteers stopped showing up. The dogs were no longer called out. Even the reporters had moved on to other stories. All that was left were the Hughes family's prayers, and a handful of detectives who couldn't shake the feeling that they had missed something. Detective Ray Henson, the lead investigator, filed the final missing persons report on September 2, 1990. His handwriting, weary and tight, told its own story. Case suspended pending further leads. He'd spent weeks walking that same bridge, replaying the night in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the abandoned bicycle, the torn sketchbook, the muddy tire tracks that led nowhere. But without a body, a witness, or a confession, there was nothing left to pursue. Henson retired 2 years later. When he packed his desk, Sarah's photo was still pinned to the corkboard, the one that said, "Find me." Redwater did what small towns do when tragedy becomes memory. It folded it into the landscape. The bridge was repaved. The old church was painted new. But underneath it all, the unease lingered, whispered about in barber shops and church basements. Parents used Sarah's story as a warning. Don't walk home alone. Don't talk to strangers. Don't stay out after dark. And though no one said her name out loud anymore, the shadow of her absence never really left. Each year on the anniversary, Linda Hughes placed fresh flowers by the riverbank. Sometimes strangers joined her, others who had lost children, others who still believed in miracles. But as time passed, the candlelight vigils grew smaller. The world changed. Phones became smaller, streets busier, faces less familiar. And somewhere, Elizabeth Graves built an entirely new life. By the mid-1990s, Graves had completed her PhD and joined the faculty at Hillcrest University in San Marcos. Her career thrived, published papers, research grants, international conferences. To her colleagues, she was brilliant, but private. To her students, she was intimidating, but inspiring. She wore her hair in a tight bun, spoke softly but with precision, and carried an aura of calm that no one dared to question. In the 2000s, she became a department head. By 2015, she was a tenured professor, a respected name in anthropology circles, often featured in academic journals for her work on ritual death and cultural remembrance. No one in Hillcrest had ever heard of Redwater, and in Redwater, no one remembered Elizabeth Graves. But the case file stayed. In 2008, when Texas launched its cold case initiative, Sarah's file, labeled T1089 Child Missing, was digitally archived. Detectives re-examined it briefly, but found nothing new. It wasn't until 2018, when a backhoe hit something metallic in a construction site near the Redwater River bend, that the dust began to stir again. The rusted metal box they pulled out was small enough to fit in both hands, wrapped in layers of hard clay. Inside was the child's locket, initials SH still faintly legible. Beside it, a piece of faded floral cloth, wrapped carefully like a keepsake. To anyone else, it might have been dismissed as debris. But to the forensic analyst cataloging old cases that week, the initials sparked a memory. Sarah Hughes, 1989. That same afternoon, the case was reopened. Detective Maria Lopez, 43, was assigned to lead the review. She'd been born the same year Sarah vanished, and she approached the file with fresh eyes and tools that hadn't existed in 1990. Digital imaging restored the original field notes. DNA extraction tech, far more sensitive than its predecessors, was applied to the scrap of fabric. When the first partial DNA match came back, a degraded sample consistent with female genetic material, Lopez widened the search. She cross-referenced every known visitor in the Redwater area that summer. That's when a single name surfaced from an old university research database. Elizabeth Graves, Anthropology Department, University of Houston, 1989 field study. The archived file included scanned documents, among them, a signed field equipment log. The same year, the same week. And a note scribbled in the margin of her own paperwork. Sample taken near creek, Redwater. It was small. It was fragile. But it was the first real lead in 3 decades. By autumn 2018, Lopez and her team were deep into what they now called Operation Red Memory. They drove to Houston, tracking down old professors and research assistants from Graves's graduate cohort. Most barely remembered her. One, however, Dr. Paul Fenwick, now retired, mentioned that Graves's fieldwork that summer had been unusually solitary. She didn't like company, Fenwick said locals were too sensitive about death. She'd stay out past midnight taking notes. We joked she was studying ghosts. Her old dorm storage was long cleared out, but her research artifacts had been sent to Hillcrest University when she joined the faculty, stored for decades in a campus archive. Inside one of the sealed boxes was a canvas field bag labeled Graves E. 1989. When forensic tech, consistent with the partial sample recovered from the locket's wrapping, and that was enough. By early 2019, a warrant was prepared. In February, investigators quietly surveilled Graves for 6 weeks, mapping her routines, tracking her correspondence, reviewing her public lectures. She was calm, consistent, unshakable, until the day of her arrest. When the agents arrived that morning, she didn't run. She didn't protest. She simply looked at Detective Lopez and said, "You finally dug deep enough, didn't you?" The meaning of those words still puzzles investigators. Was it a confession? A taunt? Or just a tired acknowledgement that the past never truly disappears? It only waits to be uncovered. And so, after 30 years, the Hughes case, long faded into local legend, was alive again. The files that had gathered dust now sat open under harsh fluorescent lights. The bridge where her bicycle was found became a memorial site again. And for the first time since that summer in 1989, Redwater, Texas, had an answer, or at least the start of one. But the question that still lingered, the one that made detectives uneasy, was why? Why had Graves taken an interest in a 14-year-old girl? Why had she stayed in Redwater so long after her study ended? And why, in all those years, had she never once left Texas? The answers would come slowly, painfully, and only after investigators began piecing together the disturbing history that tied Elizabeth Graves not just to Sarah, but to other disappearances that had gone unnoticed. And that's where the next chapter begins. For nearly 3 decades, the Redwater case had existed only as a dusty file, a ghost story whispered by old officers, a faded photo on a mother's dresser. But in 2019, everything changed. The catalyst wasn't a confession or a witness. It was a coincidence. In January of that year, Detective Maria Lopez, now part of the Texas Cold Case Task Force, was reviewing unsolved files flagged for potential DNA reevaluation. She'd seen hundreds of them, missing teens, unidentified remains, forgotten reports. But the Hughes file caught her attention. The way the notes were written, it felt unfinished, Lopez later said, like someone was still waiting for us to turn the page. The rusted tin box discovered the year before had been logged, tested, and stored, but not fully analyzed. The initial DNA tests were inconclusive. However, advancements in touch DNA recovery and environmental preservation testing meant even degraded samples could now yield results. Lopez ordered a retest. 2 weeks later, a call came from the Austin Crime Lab. Trace DNA had been extracted from the interior cloth wrapping inside the box. It was weak, fragmented, but enough to establish 2 partial profiles, one belonging to a female and the other to an unknown contaminant consistent with age-related degradation. The female DNA did not match Sarah Hughes, but when compared to databases of individuals who had provided samples for academic research during the late 1980s, one match appeared with startling clarity. Elizabeth Graves, Ph.D., now a tenured professor at Hillcrest University. At first, Lopez couldn't believe it. The match was circumstantial, not criminal, and Graves had never been listed as a suspect. Still, curiosity turned to suspicion when she read the old field report found in Graves's archived materials, one that described her research area as precisely where Sarah's bicycle had been discovered. How had a woman collecting folklore and burial data ended up in the same place, at the same time, connected by DNA to a missing child? Lopez decided to dig deeper. Through university archives, she uncovered an unpublished essay in Graves' early research drafts titled, "The Ritual of Offering, Symbolism in the Preservation of Innocence." It described an unnamed rural community in Texas and made repeated reference to a young subject whose spirit symbolized loss made whole through ritual memory. The tone was academic, but chilling. One line read, "The subject is chosen not for who she is, but for what she represents. Unspoiled passage between this life and the next." Investigators began to wonder whether Graves' work on death and cultural symbolism had crossed into something far darker, an obsession that blurred the lines between observation and participation. Meanwhile, Lopez tracked down people who had known Graves during her time in Redwater. Most were elderly now, their memories hazy. But one stood out. Martha Dunn, the farmer's wife who had rented Graves a guest room that summer. When Lopez showed her a photo, Martha hesitated before nodding. That's her. Quiet woman. Always watching. Always writing. Then she added something that chilled Lopez to her core. "I remember she had a visitor that June, a little girl. Came by on a bicycle. Stayed about an hour. I remember because she left her sketchbook on the porch. The woman said she'd return it." That girl, Lopez realized, could only have been Sarah Hughes. The investigation deepened. Detectives obtained a warrant to access Graves's storage unit near campus, one she had maintained since 1998. Inside, they found boxes of old photographs, research notes, and personal letters. Among them was a sealed envelope labeled Redwater 1989 Archive. Inside, faded Polaroids of churchyards, crosses, empty fields, and one photograph that froze the entire room. It showed a young girl sitting on the edge of the Redwater Bridge, head bowed, sketchbook in her lap. The timestamp, June 5, 1989. The same day Sarah vanished. Graves had claimed to have left town that afternoon, but that photograph proved she hadn't. By March 2019, Lopez's team had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to justify forensic excavation around the old Redwater mission site, where Graves had conducted her burial studies. On April 14th, while clearing an overgrown section near the abandoned cemetery, a cadaver dog alerted twice within a 10-foot radius. Beneath 3 feet of compacted soil, searchers found what appeared to be a fragmented child's shoe, half preserved by the dry clay. Forensic testing later confirmed it matched the imprint pattern of the bicycle shoe Sarah's parents had described 3 decades earlier. Though not a body, it was enough to reopen the case under the classification of probable homicide. What with mounting evidence, the task force compiled a full timeline linking Elizabeth Graves to Sarah's disappearance. June 1989, Graves and Sarah meet at St. Agnes Church. June 5th, Graves is seen photographing the Redwater Bridge. Sarah disappears that evening. June 6th, Graves files a field note referencing storm near bridge and subject interrupted. June 7th, she leaves town. July 1989, submits a field report referencing preservation through offering. 1990, Sarah's bicycle recovered near the same area. Every line pointed toward her. Still, Lopez knew that building a case after 30 years required more than implication. They needed irrefutable physical evidence, or a confession. So they turned to digital forensics. Graves had been a meticulous academic. She digitized most of her archives in the early 2000s. Investigators secured access to her old university email and research server. Buried in a 2003 folder labeled Teaching Slides was an image labeled Ritual 1989 JPG. The file appeared damaged, but data recovery revealed the faint outline of a girl's face reflected in the glass of a church window, the same structure near where Sarah's locket had been found. When the metadata was extracted, the capture date once again read June 5, 1989, 7:41 p.m., the last known moment of Sarah Hughes's life. By May 2019, the Texas Attorney General's office approved an arrest warrant for Professor Elizabeth Graves, citing murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. When officers arrived at Hillcrest University, she was teaching an upper division seminar titled Memory and the Dead. Students watched as agents entered the lecture hall. Graves stood motionless, hands at her sides. "Are you Dr. Elizabeth Graves?" one agent asked. "I am," she said calmly. "You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Hughes." The room fell silent. Students later said the only sound was the faint hum of the projector, still displaying the lecture slide that read, "The past never dies, it only waits." News of the arrest spread fast. National outlets ran the headline, "Professor arrested in 30-year-old Texas cold case." Former students described her as brilliant. Colleagues called her misunderstood. But to the Hughes family, and to the people of Redwater, it was a name they hadn't spoken in years, suddenly made real again. After 30 years of silence, justice had finally knocked. And as investigators escorted Graves down the courthouse steps, Detective Lopez couldn't shake the image from her mind. The woman who had studied death her entire life, now surrounded by it. The case was no longer a mystery. It was a reckoning. The arrest of Professor Elizabeth Graves made national headlines, but for investigators it was only the beginning. A case built on fragments, soil, photographs, DNA decades old, needed one final layer: scientific certainty. Detective Maria Lopez and the Texas Cold Case Task Force spent the next 6 months reconstructing a chain of evidence that had stretched over 30 years. Each test, each cross-check, each sample became a piece of a puzzle whose edges had long faded. At the Austin Forensic Sciences Division, analysts began with the most fragile clue, the cloth fragment from the rusted box. Advanced scanning electron microscopy revealed traces of mineralized particles unique to the Redwater riverbank, suggesting it had been buried in the same soil as the child's shoe. But what caught the lab's attention wasn't the dirt. It was the faint residue embedded deep in the fibers. The chemical signature matched formaldehyde, a preservation agent used primarily in embalming and laboratory preparation. And according to university records, Elizabeth Graves had ordered several liters of formaldehyde in May 1989 for sample preservation. It was the first direct scientific link between Graves' academic research and the evidence buried in Redwater. But Lopez wanted more. She wanted a face, a motive, a truth that science could speak aloud. Using isotope ratio mass spectrometry, technicians analyzed the degraded locket and hair strand found in the box. The isotopic patterns in the calcium and keratin matched environmental data from the Hughes family's well water, confirming the locket once belonged to Sarah. That meant the box, carefully sealed and buried, wasn't random. It was a memorial, a ritual. Someone had buried it deliberately. Next came the breakthrough that shifted the case from possibility to proof. In early 2020, forensic genealogists uploaded the partial DNA profile recovered from the field bag to GED Match, a public genetic database used in cold case work. Within days, the algorithm produced a partial match, a second cousin of Elizabeth Graves residing in Ohio. That confirmed it. The DNA on the cloth and inside the bag wasn't contamination. It belonged to Graves herself. Lopez called it the moment the ground stopped shifting. "That was when we knew," she said. She wasn't just near the scene. She was the scene. Meanwhile, The interrogation room at the Travis County Sheriff's Office became the quiet stage for what would be one of Texas' most haunting exchanges. Graves sat calmly, hands folded, her silver hair neatly pinned. She spoke softly, never raising her voice, always composed, the same demeanor she'd carried through decades of lectures. When Lopez slid the photograph across the table, the one showing Sarah on the bridge, Graves's eyes flickered just once. "Do you remember her?" Lopez asked. "I remember all my subjects," Graves replied. It was the only time she referred to Sarah directly, not as a child, not as a person, but as a subject. Investigators pressed on the timeline. Why had she stayed in Redwater after her supposed departure? Why did her notes reference preserved innocence? Her response was chillingly academic. "I studied rituals," she said. "Some cultures believed in keeping purity close to death, so that it never decayed. You wouldn't understand." Lopez leaned forward. "You turned a study into a sacrifice." Graves didn't answer. She just smiled faintly. When the recording was played later in court filings, analysts noted the absence of remorse, only detachment. Outside the lab and interrogation rooms, the case gripped the public. Documentaries dissected her lectures. Journalists combed through her published works, finding passages that now read like confessions hidden in plain sight. One paper, published in 1994, described the burial of memory as a cultural act of devotion. Another cited the offering of an uncorrupted spirit as an eternal anthropological motif. Those who had once called her visionary now called her predator, and as the evidence mounted, one haunting theory began to emerge, that Sarah wasn't Graves' only victim. Files from nearby counties began surfacing. 2 other disappearances between 1987 and 1991, both young girls, both near towns where Graves had conducted field research. None had ever been solved. The Texas Bureau of Investigation quietly reopened both. By mid-2020, prosecutors had built an airtight case. DNA, photographic evidence, timeline inconsistencies, and Graves' own words formed the spine of a case that spanned 3 generations. But as the news spread, the question haunting everyone was no longer, did she do it? It was how many more were there? The truth, investigators feared, might be buried in the same silence that had cloaked Redwater for 30 years, beneath the dust, beneath the ritual, beneath the woman who had dedicated her life to studying death, only to become its instrument. In the weeks following Elizabeth Graves' arrest, the media painted 2 versions of her. To the public, she was the brilliant professor, articulate, elegant, an expert in cultural anthropology who had lectured across Europe and advised on museum preservation projects. To investigators, she was something else entirely, a woman whose obsession with death had spilled beyond theory into practice. Detective Maria Lopez called it a study that never ended. Born in 1961 in Amarillo, Texas, Elizabeth grew up the only child of devoutly religious parents. Her father was a mortician who ran the local funeral home. Her mother, a quiet organist who rarely left the chapel. Neighbors recalled a solemn little girl who preferred graveyards to playgrounds. By age 12, she could recite Latin hymns and catalog every saint depicted in the stained glass of her parish. At 16, she began keeping notebooks filled with drawings of burial rituals from around the world. When her father died in 1978, Elizabeth helped prepare his body for burial, insisting on doing it herself. According to her mother, she called it a way of understanding peace. But to those who studied her later, it was the first sign that Elizabeth Graves's curiosity had crossed into fixation. By the time she entered the University of Houston, she had fully immersed herself in anthropology, particularly the intersection of faith, death, and preservation. Professors described her as brilliant, but detached. She didn't socialize, rarely smiled, and spent hours in the lab dissecting animal remains for study. Her thesis, The Memory of the Body, Preserving Innocence in Death, won her accolades. But years later, when investigators reread it, they found disturbing undertones. In some cultures, innocence is a vessel, pure, uncorrupted, unburdened by sin. To preserve it is to resist decay itself. The words took on new meaning once Sarah Hughes's name entered the picture. During her 1989 field research in Redwater, Elizabeth's academic logs showed an abrupt shift. She'd originally applied to study mortuary practices among rural Christian communities, but her notes turned increasingly erratic. Fragments about ritual offerings, childlike purity, and the bridge as a threshold. Detectives later learned that she had visited St. Agnes Church repeatedly that June, speaking often with the parish priest about symbolic renewal through sacrifice. When the priest was questioned in 2019, he said she'd been fascinated by the children's choir, particularly one young girl who sketched angels in the margins of her hymnal. That girl, he confirmed, was Sarah Hughes. Colleagues at Hillcrest University said Elizabeth never mentioned Redwater. When asked about her early fieldwork, she'd smile politely and change the subject. But her private writings told a darker story. Hidden among her archived papers was a notebook labeled Continuations. Inside were sketches of figures lying in shallow graves, surrounded by crosses. Under one drawing, she had written, "She watches over them still." Psychologists who later examined the material believed graves exhibited signs of ritualistic delusion and narcissistic detachment, a need to exert control over life and death, masked under intellectual justification. She didn't see herself as a killer. She saw herself as a curator of purity. Investigators also uncovered that in the early 1990s, after leaving Redwater, Graves corresponded with a French anthropologist who specialized in post-mortem preservation. In one letter, she described her work as living ethnography, observation through embodiment. When shown this letter in 2020, Lopez remarked quietly, "She didn't just study death, she practiced it." The most unsettling revelation came from her former student, Daniel Reeve, who had served as her research assistant for over a decade. He told investigators that Graves kept locked boxes in her office, claiming they contained historical artifacts. He'd never been allowed to open them, but he recalled her once saying, "Some memories must be kept sealed to remain pure." To him, it had sounded poetic. To Lopez, it sounded like confession. By the time her psychological profile was complete, one thing was clear. Elizabeth Graves didn't kill out of rage or impulse. She killed out of ideology, convinced she was preserving something sacred through death. She was both scientist and believer, academic and fanatic, a woman who blurred the line between ritual and reality, until it disappeared completely. As Detective Lopez put it in her final report, for 30 years, she hid in plain sight, a scholar of death teaching life how to forget. And though the case had finally caught up to her, the full scope of her darkness was only beginning to surface. The morning news broke like wildfire. Texas professor charged in 1989 murder of missing girl, missing. For those who had once studied under her, it felt impossible. For the people of Redwater, it felt like justice, decades late, but still breathing. Professor Elizabeth Graves' arrest sent shockwaves through the state's academic and religious communities. Hillcrest University's polished marble halls, once echoing with applause after her guest lectures, were now crawling with reporters, flashing cameras, and stunned faculty whispering her name like a curse. She sat right there. One student told local news, pointing to the front row of a lecture hall. She'd talk about anthropology and ethics. She used to say, "Death reveals truth." I just never thought she meant it literally. At the Austin County Detention Center, Graves was formally booked. Cameras caught her being escorted into the facility, her face pale and expressionless, a crucifix pendant glinting faintly against her dark clothing. It was a haunting image, one that would appear on every evening broadcast across the country. Behind bars, her composure never faltered. She asked for tea, quoted Latin verses, and refused to sign any statement without her attorney. Detectives described her as eerily calm, like someone watching a lecture unfold rather than living it. In Redwater, the arrest reopened wounds that had never healed. Neighbors who had lived through the 1989 summer of fear gathered outside St. Agnes Church with candles and framed photos of Sarah Hughes. Her mother, now gray-haired and frail, stood silently at the edge of the crowd as reporters shouted questions. "We prayed for this day," she finally said, voice trembling. "But it doesn't bring my baby back." Inside, Father O'Donnell, the same priest who had once spoken with Graves about sacrifice and renewal, delivered a sermon that Sunday, unlike any other. "Evil," he said, his voice echoing through the wooden pews, "doesn't always come in darkness. Sometimes it wears a collar. Sometimes it smiles and teaches." The congregation wept. By mid-June, the case had become a national fascination. Talk shows debated the psychological nature of Graves's crimes. True crime podcasts dissected her papers line by line, suggesting hidden meanings in her academic work. One viral headline read, "The Professor of Death, Scholar or Serial Killer?" Investigators stayed quiet, releasing only selective information: the DNA link, the photographic evidence, the recovered shoe fragment, enough to confirm the charges but not the depth of what they had found. Behind the scenes, however, prosecutors were overwhelmed. Graves's intellect made her unpredictable. She refused plea deals, refused to break. When offered leniency in exchange for a full confession, she smiled faintly and said, "You can't convict a philosophy." At Hillcrest University, staff uncovered more materials from her office: boxes of research papers, old Polaroids, even preserved insects and handwritten diaries. One chilling entry dated June 1989 read, "The child represents purity before decay. The ritual preserves her." It was enough to silence even her most loyal defenders. Outside, the world turned Graves into a myth. Protesters gathered with placards reading "Justice for Sarah," while others, her remaining supporters, argued she was being scapegoated, misunderstood, her work twisted by those who fear what they don't understand. The divide was sharp, emotional, and deeply human. The same mixture of outrage and disbelief that marked every great American scandal. For Detective Lopez, the noise faded the moment she revisited the field site one last time. Standing at the edge of the Redwater Bridge where it had all begun, she whispered to the wind, "We finally found her." The cicadas buzzed. The air hung heavy with dust and memory. And somewhere beyond the trees, 30 years of silence finally gave way to something that sounded like peace. The courthouse steps were silent the morning Elizabeth Graves was transferred to federal custody. No cameras, no shouting. Just a few scattered onlookers, older now, some holding folded newspapers with her face printed in grainy black and white. She had finally been charged. Murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. But to many, the verdict didn't feel like victory. It felt like the closing of a chapter too heavy to reread. In Redwater, the bridge where Sarah Hughes disappeared became a memorial. Each June, townspeople gather there with candles and flowers. The water beneath runs slower now, narrowed by sediment and time, but it still carries whispers of that summer, the one that never truly ended. Sarah's mother, now nearly 70, refuses interviews. The last time she spoke publicly, she simply said, "Justice isn't what you see in court, it's what lets you sleep again." Detective Maria Lopez keeps Sarah's file on her desk, not as a trophy but as a reminder of how science caught up with silence and how monsters sometimes hide behind education, behind intellect, behind trust. She fooled everyone, Lopez once told a documentary crew, but she couldn't fool time. At Hillcrest University, Graves's name was erased from every plaque, every faculty list, every syllabus. Her books were quietly pulled from the library shelves. Yet for those who once admired her, the erasure only deepened the unease. How had no one seen it? How had brilliance disguised brutality for so long? One of her former students, now a lecturer herself, summed it up in an interview years later. We learned to question everything, except the people who taught us to. In 2022, a graduate researcher revisiting Graves's archived work uncovered one final chilling note, a scrap of paper hidden inside a journal. Burial is never the end, it's preservation. The handwriting matched hers. Today, the Redwater case remains one of Texas's most unsettling cold case resolutions. Not because of what was discovered, but because of what it revealed. That evil can wear the face of mentorship, that devotion can warp into delusion, and that sometimes the pursuit of knowledge goes too far into the dark. The field where Sarah was found has since been fenced off. Wild grass grows where evidence once lay, and a small plaque stands near the entrance, in memory of those who were never forgotten. If stories like this remind you how truth survives even the deepest silence, don't forget to subscribe for more true crime documentaries like this one. Your engagement helps us keep telling the stories of victims who deserve to be remembered. Before we dive into the next case, let us know in the comments. Do you think evil like this is born or made?